Hello again, it's Alan Macon, the local history tutor for Knowsley Face, with a continuing series of short videos on the local history of Knowsley and Liverpool throughout the centuries. This short video will concentrate on Liverpool Theatres, particularly in the last 250 years. It will be looking at Liverpool's famous three historical theatres. First one, we'll build the Theatre Royal in Williamson Square. Then we'll look at arguably Liverpool's most famous modern theatre, the Empire. And then we'll look at the Rotunda Theatre, which was located in the north end of Liverpool along Scotland Road. So Liverpool theatres can be traced back hundreds of years, but in the last 250 years that we'd recognise them as modern theatres. This short video will be a collection of photographs and archive material to illustrate Liverpool's theatrical history. So the first page you can see is an illustration of the Theatre Royal in Williamson Square and what Williamson Square looked like way back in 1820, exactly 200 years ago. But before we delve into that and zoom into that, I just want to look at the general history of theatres. So the article says, although theatres as places of entertainment were recorded existed in Liverpool since the 1500s, when Liverpool was a little village, probably 1,000, 2,000 people. So you can trace it back 500 years, but it's the Drury Lane Theatre of 1750 is considered to be the first modern theatre in Liverpool. Drury Lane is off Chapel Street in Liverpool city centre. It's only a few minutes walk from St Nicholas Church by the Pier Head. And obviously people might recognise the name Drury Lane, which is obviously an allusion to the famous Drury Lane in London. What happened in the 1500s, 1600s, with the famous theatres in London, the actors in the summer season would come up north to the provinces, and in the summer seasons they would put on plays in the 1500s and 1600s. But it's not until the 1700s, when Liverpool takes an explosion in population, that theatre becomes very popular. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Theatre Royal in Williamson Square. So we've got a lovely illustration of Williamson Square, famous Liverpool Square, back exactly 200 years ago. And that's the theatre, a very distinct building with a house next to it. So that's Williamson Square exactly 200 years ago. So we zoom out again. We continue with the history. So the Theatre Royal in Williamson Square dates to 1772, the Georgian period when Liverpool was booming with its docks and its population. And when the newly built Theatre Royal, it cost what was then a gigantic sum of £6,000 and was designed by a national architect by the name of Sir William Chambers. The original theatre was knocked down in 1803. So the building you see on the picture dates from 1803 to be replaced by a horseshoe-shaped theatre building which stood, believe it or not, until the early 1970s. So if you can remember Liverpool in the early 1970s, you would have saw this in Williamson Square. So this is an actual photograph of Williamson Square in the 1950s and the 1960s. So Williamson Square in the 50s is the top one, the black and white one. The coloured one is the late 1960s, showing the former Theatre Royal, which became over the decades in the 20th century known as the Union Code Storage. They kept ice in there, and the ice was used by the department stores in Liverpool city centre. And rather strange to our eyes, in Williamson Square, probably until the early 1970s, 50 years ago, you could actually physically park in Williamson Square. So I'll just quickly zoom in. So this is Williamson Square in the 1950s. Union Code Storage Company, the original Theatre Royal Theatre. The bottom one, nice coloured one, again you can see the theatre on the corner with various buildings in the background. So that's probably the late 1960s, possibly early 1970s. If you move on to modern Liverpool, modern Williamson Square, on the site of the theatre from 1772, it was replaced some maybe 15 years ago by the Liverpool Football Club shop outlet, site of the old theatre in Williamson Square. So this is what you would see today if you were to visit Williamson Square. The site of the theatre is one of Liverpool's retail outlets. Then we come to arguably Liverpool's most famous theatre, still there today, visited by thousands of people, before the COVID pandemic. So the Empire Theatre, the original theatre on the site of the modern Empire Theatre, was built way back in 1866, mid-Victorian period, and was then called the Prince of Wales Theatre and Opera House. A year later, in 1867, it was renamed Alexander Theatre and Opera House. Opera was attended by Liverpool's rich sort of middle class, upper middle classes. In 1895, the late Victorian period, it was renamed again the Empire Theatre of Varieties, and electricity was installed, which then was a revolutionary idea. So that's the site of the present day modern or relatively modern Empire Theatre. If we move on again, during the First World War, 1418, popular stars included Vesta Tilley, George Robey and Harry Lauder. They were sort of huge stars of the day, international stars as well as British stars. They come to the modern Empire Theatre in 1924, 1925. The site was totally levelled and rebuilt. So by 1925, the opening of the modern Empire Theatre was built and opened, and then it was the largest two-tier seating in the country with a capacity of 2,248. Some 15-20 years ago, the modern Empire was, the stage was enlarged, and the famous pub next door, the Legs of Man, was knocked down to make way for an atrium. So this is a lovely photograph of the first theatre on the site of the Empire. This is the so-called Prince of Wales Theatre and Opera House back in 1866. Beautiful facade, sort of semi-classical Baroque style on the site of the Empire. Behind it would have been Liverpool's Lime Street Station, being very busy. Lime Street Station was opened in 1836. So this building was built about 30 years later after the building of Lime Street Station. So that's 1866. If you move on again, by the late 1920s, this was like a poster, advertising poster or postcard of the Empire and Lime Street back in the late 1920s. So Lime Street and Empire Theatre, this particular theatre was opened, the modern one, about 1925. So obviously some of the buildings, not surprisingly, have disappeared over the years. The bottom of London Road, that building's long since gone. Famously, as the Empire grew, by the 1950s became hugely popular, and by 1953 the huge international star Frank Sinatra appeared. The famous legendary Frank Sinatra appeared at the Empire in 1953, and this is the poster. He was advertised to come on stage at 6:20 and 8:35. Frank Sinatra, the great surrounds a supporting company, Billy Turnett and his orchestra. So it must have been a huge audience to see the likes of the legendary Frank Sinatra. The last theatre I want to look at is the Rotunda Theatre in Scotland Road, the corner of Scotland Road, Stanley Road. Just quickly show you the picture of it. So the Rotunda Theatre started life as a music hall way back in 1863. The theatre was very popular and was enlarged on several occasions. The building eventually comprised of a theatre on the second floor with billiard rooms on the first floor, games rooms in the basement and a hotel at the southern end. So it was hugely popular. That part of Liverpool was very full of rows of terraced houses, a very dense population, so it was hugely popular amongst the local people. If you move on again, I'll quickly show you a couple of photographs. The top one, by 1940 the German bombers come to Liverpool and they destroyed the actual theatre in September 1940. This is an actual photograph, real photograph, taken about 1900 of the actual black and white Rotunda Theatre. So it lasted another 40 years before it was destroyed in 1940. Lastly, I'd just like to show you very quickly an advertisement poster from the Rotunda, Stanley Road, Scotland Road, revelling in swing. This dates from 1937. 3 years later, it would be totally demolished. So as usual, I'd just like to say thanks for tuning in. Please stay tuned in to Knowsley Face, Knowsley Recovery website for any tips on mental health and well-being, and please leave any comments you wish on the website. Thank you.